Hey, Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom, all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Kakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of great Mustaf, teachers his truth, and citations to the sincere Akim and Aqua of the lesson. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Brother Requai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, is just going to be a little bit about etiquette in regards to dealing with the hoary head, right? So the hoary head can refer to people who are of age, older parents, conduct, you know, with dealing with this demographic. And I sincerely pray that this lesson is edifying. So I typed it in here in the AI overview, and it says the hoary head refers to the head of hair that is gray or white due to old age. It is a common expression used to describe elderly individuals and is often associated with wisdom, experience, and respect. It says the term hoary itself means gray or white with age. So in a figurative meaning, below here, it says in the context of the hoary head, it says it signifies the gray or white hair that comes with advanced age. It says in many cultures and traditions, the hoary head is seen as a symbol of wisdom, experience, and honor. It often represents a life well lived and a respect that should be given to elders, right? And we have that within our customs. So with dealing with this, if you are surrounded by somebody who is in this age group, at moments it can be challenging, but sometimes there is a level of patience that that is often needed to be exercised, right? So when I say patience, I'm saying that because sometimes, and you being a younger person, sometimes we tend to get a little ahead of ourselves because we are in our mental strength, and sometimes that person might need a little bit of help, because their mental faculties are not as strong as they used to be. And sometimes that causes us, as being from a younger generation, I'm speaking from experience too, because, I used to do this actually. I used to look down, not necessarily look down on somebody, but essentially, because I'm in my mental youth, I'm in my 20s, I'm young, I'm, full of that, my mental faculties as well as my physical faculties are there. And, we tend to look down on the elderly themselves because, they may not know how to do certain things, or they may have lost an idea of how to do certain things. Like, so for example, I want to use this as an example, how to navigate certain things, because, technology has changed from, decade to decade, it never stays stagnant, right? So when I say help, I mean, so doing certain things and helping them with those certain things, right? That is, if you do that, then that's able to, essentially you're able to meet them on their level, right? As opposed to kind of looking down at them and thinking, oh man, you should know how to do this and do that, and so on and so forth, right? They still have a library of wisdom, they can always share, because of a plethora of experience, right? Going back into that sentiment of honor and respect, right? And as a culture, we as a people, we have this, within our culture. But when it comes to, from what I've noticed, Jake, especially here in the West, Jake has forgotten how to deal with those things. you know that reverence of, I'm not, and I want to kind of open it up a little bit, not just the hoary head, elderly, parents, um, what's it called? Even like people like teachers too, there is a level of respect that kind of withers away, when Jake has been Babylon way too long, that sentiment of respect when it comes to the older demographic is kind of like, it's not really there as much as it used to, especially with a lot of these young YNs, right? Because they're not being taught they're not taught the righteousness of the law, right? And that's what the law is. It's supposed to bring us to a sentiment of elevation, because it shows a distinction between us as a royal noble people and the rest of the heathens, right, which are regarded as nothing. They're supposed to look at us in terms of a symbol, a trendsetter in righteousness of how to conduct ourselves, right? They should look at us and be like, oh, this great nation is a like it says in Deuteronomy, is a wise and understanding people, right? So before I ramble on too much, this is Leviticus chapter 19. Actually, I want to see this in the. Just bear with me. Hold on. This is Leviticus chapter 19, verse 32, and it says, "Thou shalt rise up before, excuse me, the hoary head, and honor the face of the old man, and fear the Most High Yahweh Bashem El Shai. I am the Lord." In the AMP, in the Amplified Version, it says, "You shall rise before the gray-headed and honor the aged, and you shall fear the Lord with profound reverence. I am the Lord Yahweh." Right? So, there is a certain level of reverence, within our culture we have for people who are a little bit, more on the older side, right? We don't really cast them aside, and in this society, they put them into homes and so on and so forth, right? Like for example, and I'll just kind of jump in and throw in my experience a little bit here and there. Like in the Caribbean islands, one of the things I remember very, very strongly was the fact that when you grow up, you have there's a level of etiquette and manners when it comes to not just people of that are up in age, right? It's just people, like people in general too, but essentially people also in authority. So I would include people such as teachers, people who serve you like at the bank, people who, you know what I'm saying? Like there was a certain level of respect, for people who were doing essentially a service, you know, um, but elderly also. So when you're going and you're either walking on the street, or you're walking, like you're going to a bus, or you're probably you see some, you're walking on the beach, here and there, and you come into close, quarters with somebody, those situations, you say good afternoon, you say good morning, you say good evening, you say good night, you enter somebody's house, and you see, essentially elderly there, you essentially you greet them, right? So it's just a level of, and maintaining a certain level of respect, honor, for people who essentially lived a long life. And coming, when Jake grows up here, they, like I said before, they tend to forget a lot of these things, so they start to become even more of a degenerate plant, because we don't really hold these things to a certain degree as much as we used to, you know. Go back here. The scriptures do say that when the Gentiles do by nature the things that are contained in the law, it's like a law unto themselves, roughly paraphrase. So even in our Gentile state of mind, there are still a lot of things, within the culture, I would say the so-called Caribbean culture, they still hold dear to, because they know this is a more orderly way. I just find that when they come to the West and the children are completely surrounded by all these different heathens, they tend to forget those little cultural norms, which is really going back into the law, like I just brought up earlier, right? So let me get let me go to Galatians. Just bear with me. Okay, actually, no. 1 second. Okay, I'll read Colossians 3, verse 12. This is in the AMP. It says, "So as the Most High's own chosen people who are holy, set apart, sanctified for His purpose, and well beloved by the Most High Yahweh Bashmal Shai Himself, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, which has the power to endure whatever injustice, unpleasantness comes with good temper." And I wanted to touch on this, just adding in a personal experience, because something that I've learned, being in this truth is, one is character, and exemplifying. I want to just touch on these two traits here. Essentially, is gentleness and patience, because especially when dealing with the hoary head, there's a certain level of patience that's needed to be exercised, because sometimes you can have little, I don't want to say you have a little beef with them, but essentially they might do something that kind of rubs you the wrong way. I'm kind of speaking more, from like personal experience, and they may have a very systematic way of doing things, and it's not that they're trying to cause a certain type of ill will, or they're trying to cause some type of what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to say harm towards you, like, try and get at you in a passive aggressive way, but they might just, sometimes they might just have a little stubborn, ways about them, and you kind of just have to, be patient with them. And another reason why I say patience also is because, like the reason I mentioned earlier, and I'm guilty of this, but one of the things that we tend to lose patience on is because we are in our mental strength. We think that because we're young and vibrant, we lose sight of they're not in their mental strength as they used to be. So you kind of have to essentially kind of like subject yourself, right? And I don't want to say lower in extent, but you kind of have to lower yourself to be able to help them within doing some things, right? They don't, they may not move as fast as they used to be, right? It doesn't mean that you have to scorn them. They may not you know they might do certain things, and they're not doing it on purpose, like forget to put the forget to lock the door or something like that. Certain things, their mental strength isn't there. Right? So you kind of have to turn the other cheek in regards to a lot of these little things, right? They're not I mean, you could probably, gently remind them, you know, but you don't come off in a sense where um that is super harsh. That's another thing. That's a no-no. I've done it. Don't don't do that. Don't do that. Scripture say lean not upon your own understanding, right? And that's something you don't want to do. There's a certain level of conduct and reverence you have when you come to essentially rebuking an elder. And I want to get that later on in a second, right? But I kind of want to stress the importance of the fruits of the Spirit here, because that is really one of the things you'll exercise in dealing with the hoary head, right? Dealing with somebody that's a bit up in age. My father is he's in his 80s at this point, right? So, there are certain things, like I said, mental faculties, it just it's not all in their strength, right? They do what they can with the vessel that they have, right? But even all of us, we get old, right? And we forget certain things, right? Even I forget certain things too, right? So there's a certain level of compassion that's needed to be exercised. You don't you don't trip. Don't trip, man. Don't trip. You don't trip over little things, right? Because at the end of the day, we still need compassion upon us, right? We still need forgiveness too, right? So um I think it's Sirach. One second. This is Sirach chapter 8 verse 6, and it says, dishonor not a man in his old age, for even some of us wax old, right? Certain things he might do, he might forget to, turn the TV off, or he might forget to, they might, they're not doing something that's wicked, they just, sometimes they don't, it ain't all there, right? You don't look down on them, but, you try to, you just try to be gentle. That's all I'm saying, right? Um, it's fruits of the Spirit, pretty much, right? It's really fruits of the Spirit, right? We're not trying to exemplify fruits of the flesh and trying to cause, you know, um, you know, trying to, be a tyrant, trying to be rough, and you need a little level of patience and level-headedness, right? It's not easy, but it's really rewarding, right? If within the Spirit, of course, right? Because you're exemplifying these different fruits of the Spirit, right? Because the flesh is very, very, me, I. So to subject yourself to another, it can be very, very difficult, right? So that's sometimes things we might have to face, right? So I had to deal with those kinds of situations, and dealing with my father. It's you just learn how to deal, and apply wisdom, right? Scriptures say that wisdom is the principal thing, right? So, and the last point I kind of want to hit, I think that's in First Timothy. One second. you know okay, this is First Timothy 5:1. I'll read in the KJV first here, and it says, rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren. In the AMP, it says, do not sharply reprimand an older man, but appeal to him as you would a father to younger men as brothers, right? So it's just a little level of conduct doing this. And speaking from experience, I've done I've done the complete opposite of what the precept is saying, and my suggestion is to not do so, because it never ever ends well, right? It never comes off with the same force, right? The scriptures talk about essentially a soft answer turns away wrath, right? So it's just a certain sentiment that is needed to be exercised while still maintaining a certain level of respect, you know, for somebody within that age bracket. You know what I'm saying? Especially if it's your own father, especially if it's an elder, especially if it's in um, I've had not this situation with teachers, but in, like, for example, you know, growing up in the Caribbean, one of the things, you don't, teachers, yes, teachers still make mistakes. They still make mistakes at the end of the day, but it's just a way to go about it in in an orderly fashion. We're not niggas. We're not, rolling tough guys and biker gangs and unruly people, right? We're a noble people unto the Lord, Yahweh Bashem Shai, right? The Lord Yahweh Bashem Shai has chosen thee to be a special people above, right? So part of royalty is also conduct, right? Even the people in the Buckingham Palace, when they sit down with the Queen, you know, they still understand they need to have a certain level of conduct in the way that they eat, the way that they deport themselves with being around the Queen. Well, she's dead now, but you know what I'm saying. Um, they even understand that there's a certain level of conduct. Well, they took that from us basically, but the point is they understand being in the presence of royalty. There's still a certain type of reverence and a certain level of etiquette that you exercise, right? So recap: don't reprimand an elder in a sharp manner. Don't reprimand a hoary head in an extremely sharp manner. That's not the way to go. That's a no. That's a no. Done it. I'm telling you right now, do not do that. Right? It doesn't work. Right? You might be, if you have a certain kind of grievance, it's best to take a step back from the situation, cool off, recollect your thoughts, and then address it with a certain sentiment of proper decorum, and to make sure that, you're on a similar vibe, right? Don't be a complete hothead, right? Scriptures say, be angry, but, not, and sin not, right? Don't let those emotions kind of consume you. you know if you have a grievance, yes, we make mistakes. I make mistakes. They can make mistakes too. It's just a going about it in a peaceable fashion. That's all I'm saying here, right? So let me see, I think that's about it actually. Okay, I'll get this last one here. This is Sirach 42:8. And it says, be not ashamed to inform the unwise and foolish, and the extreme age that contendeth with those that are young. Those shall be those I'm sorry, thus shalt thou be truly learned and approved of all men living. Right? So, those things, you could, you know, you can kindly make kind suggestions. It's just how you go about it. And even from experience, witnessing the opposite end, I've had family members witnessing sharply reprimanding somebody of an older age, and it never ever goes well. It never ever does, right? If you're in that situation, don't do it. Approach it. You know, always recollect your thoughts, draw back. Then, when you have, some time to address the situation in a peaceable, proper, orderly fashion, right? Because you just still have to remember who you're speaking with, right? Tone, conduct, the way you say things, right? So, right? So, because I've had that situation too, and I've approached the situation, you know, um, essentially informing, my father when my father caused some sort of rubbed me the wrong way, and I approached it the way the precept explained it, right? And in doing so, what the outcome was, they apologized. We were still on the same tone, and we still have conversations to this day, right? We can still have a level-headed conversation. Is the point is just to remain level-headed and not let your emotions consume you, right? So, you don't want to be that, as scriptures say, a city that is broken down without walls, right? So, um, that's pretty much it. I'll leave it there, but I sincerely pray that and hope that this lesson is edifying. I'd just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. Until next time, I say Shalom.